The envelope sat on Margaret's kitchen table for almost an hour before she opened it. She didn't know why she waited. It was just paperwork, a routine request. She'd asked the solicitor's office for a copy of her mother's trust documents to help sort out some of the memory care admin. Straightforward, the kind of thing she'd handled 100 times as a nurse. Forms didn't frighten her. She made tea first. Then she sat down and opened it. The letterhead wasn't the one she recognized. It was a different firm entirely. She turned to the second page, then the third, scanning for her name the way you scan for something you're certain is there. It wasn't there. She went through every page again, slowly this time. Her mother's name was there. Edwin's name was there, listed as sole beneficiary and trustee. A Guildford address she didn't recognize appeared twice in the small print. Her name, Margaret Atwa O.C., named on this document since before she'd qualified as a nurse, since before her father died and made her promise to look after her mother, was nowhere. She set the pages down. This was the woman she'd driven to every chemotherapy appointment 20 years ago. The woman she'd moved back to Surrey for. The woman she'd sat with every Sunday without fail, even through the years when the visits got harder and her mother's eyes sometimes didn't quite find her face anymore. 40 years. Her name had been on this trust for 40 years. She picked up her phone, then put it down again. Someone had done this deliberately. The question was, when? Margaret was not a woman who panicked. 31 years as a nurse had cured her of that. You learned, after enough time on a ward, to hold the difficult thing at arm's length long enough to think clearly, to feel it later, to function now. So she didn't call Edwin straight away. She called the solicitor's office instead. A young man answered. She gave her name, her mother's name, the reference number printed on the cover page. She asked him calmly whether there had been an administrative error, whether perhaps an older version of the document had been sent. There was a brief pause. She heard him typing. He told her the document was correct and current. He told her the trust had been last amended 14 months ago. He told her the named beneficiary and trustee was an Edwin O.C. of Woking, Surrey. She thanked him. She hung up. Then she sat at that kitchen table in Guildford and did not move for a very long time. Outside, the street carried on. A neighbor's dog barked twice. A bin lorry groaned somewhere at the end of the road. The tea she'd made had gone cold. She hadn't been removed by accident. 14 months ago, someone had sat in a solicitor's office and made sure her name wasn't there anymore. And in those 14 months, nobody had thought to mention it, not even her brother. To understand what that document meant, what it cost her to read it, you need to understand what Margaret had given. She was the eldest. That had always meant something in the Osei family. When their father Joseph died in 1991, he left behind a modest trust, the house in Woking, some savings, a few modest investments, with one clear instruction. It was Margaret's name he put first. She was the anchor, he told her. She was the one who'd hold things together. She'd taken that seriously for 40 years. When Ruth began to slow down in her late 70s, it was Margaret who drove down from Guildford every Sunday. Margaret who researched the memory care facilities. Margaret who sat through the assessment, learned the medication schedules, and eventually paid the shortfall when the care home fees outpaced what Ruth's pension could cover. Edwin sent money occasionally. Sandra sent cards at Christmas. They were busy, Margaret understood. Edwin had built a business. They had their own lives. She hadn't resented it. Not then. The trust had always felt like a formality. Something that reflected what was already true. Margaret looked after her mother. One day, when Ruth was gone, the estate would reflect that. It wasn't about the money. It was about being seen. She had never imagined she'd need to defend it. The memory arrived quietly, the way uncomfortable things often do. About 8 months ago, Edwin had called her. A rare enough event that she'd noted it. He'd mentioned, almost in passing, that their mother had updated a few things with her affairs. Tied up some loose ends. He'd used the phrase, getting her house in order, and moved on before Margaret could ask anything specific. She'd assumed he meant a care directive. An updated power of attorney, perhaps. The kind of administrative tidying that made sense at 88. She hadn't asked for details. She trusted him. And then there were the visits. 3 Sundays in a row, the previous autumn. Edwin had called ahead of her arrival to say Ruth was too tired for company. Too fragile. Better to leave it this week. Margaret had accepted it each time. Her mother was 88. There were bad patches. She hadn't wanted to push. But 3 weeks in a row, she'd offered to come anyway, just to sit quietly. She wouldn't even need Ruth to be lucid. She knew how to just be present. Edwin had said no. Sandra had followed up with a text, something about letting Ruth rest. She'd thought they were being protective. Now she wondered what they'd needed 3 weeks to finish. She called Edwin that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised her. His voice was calm, measured, the voice he used in professional settings, not the voice of a brother caught at something. She told him she'd received the trust documents. She told him her name wasn't in them. She waited. He said he'd wondered when she'd get around to looking at those. He told her their mother had made her wishes clear in her final years of full cognitive capacity, that the amendments had been Ruth's decision, made carefully and with proper legal guidance. He told Margaret that Ruth had found it painful, the way Margaret had pulled back from the family in recent years, the way she'd made certain things difficult. He said it gently. He said he was sorry she was finding this hard to hear. Margaret sat very still on the other end of the phone. She wanted to argue, but Edwin's version of events had landed somewhere tender, because the truth was, she had pulled back a little over the past 2 years. She'd had her own health scare, a difficult winter. There were months she hadn't called as often as she should have. Had Ruth felt abandoned? Had she? Edwin said he hoped they could handle this as a family. Then he told her to take some time and call him when she processed it. She stared at the wall for a long time after he hung up. She went to visit her mother the following Saturday. Or rather, she tried. The coordinator at the memory care facility, a kind woman named Debbie who'd always greeted Margaret by name, was apologetic but firm. Edwin had updated the visitor access preferences 6 months ago. Margaret was now listed as requiring prior approval from next of kin before a visit could take place. The facility had no choice but to follow the registered instructions. Next of kin, Edwin. Margaret drove home in silence. That evening she sat with her phone and did something she hadn't done before. She scrolled back through 14 months of messages to Edwin and Sandra. The unanswered ones. The ones answered days late with a single line. The ones redirected better to discuss this in person. Mom's having a difficult week. We'll sort it when things settle down. She counted. There were 17 messages about Ruth's care that had received either no reply or a reply designed to close the conversation. She'd read each one at the time as Edwin being busy. Distracted, a man with a company to run and not enough hours in his day. She read them now as something else entirely. He hadn't been ignoring her. He'd been managing her, keeping her just close enough that she wouldn't raise the alarm, but far enough away that she couldn't see what was being moved. For 3 days, Margaret said nothing to anyone. She went through the motions. She watered the garden. She cooked meals she barely tasted. She watched the evening news without taking any of it in. She slept badly and woke early and lay in the gray Guildford light, trying to talk herself into stillness. Part of her, a significant part, wanted to let it go. Ruth was 88. She was in memory care, and she was being looked after, and she was not suffering. Starting a legal dispute over an inheritance would mean solicitors and paperwork and family meetings, and Edwin's measured voice telling everyone she was being difficult. It would mean Christmas dinners that never happened again, and cousins who took sides, and a mother who might never understand why her children were arguing. It would mean becoming the person Edwin had already described her as. The difficult one. The one who pulled back, but then the other part of her. The part that had spent 31 years on wards making sure people weren't overlooked, weren't managed, weren't quietly moved aside. That part kept returning to one word: 14 months. He'd known for 14 months. He'd sat across from her at their mother's birthday lunch 11 months ago and passed her the gravy and asked about her garden. And he'd known she hadn't pulled back. She'd been moved. The call came from Patience on a Thursday morning. Patience Ajay, Margaret's cousin, 8 years younger. A woman who chose her words carefully and didn't involve herself in things unless she felt she had no choice. She opened by saying she hoped she wasn't speaking out of turn. She'd heard, to a mutual family friend, that Margaret had been difficult about Ruth's arrangements. The phrase was Sandra's. Patience had heard it at a christening. Delivered in that particular tone, Sandra had sympathetic on the surface, pointed underneath. She was embarrassed to be repeating it. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then Patience said something that changed the shape of everything. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd attended a gathering at Edwin's home the previous spring. A family lunch. Cousins, aunts, a few of Ruth's older friends. She'd assumed Margaret was coming. She'd saved her a seat. Margaret had not been invited. She hadn't known the lunch existed. Patience was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd wondered at the time, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Margaret thanked her. She kept her voice even until the call ended. Then she stood in her kitchen and understood that the isolation hadn't been incidental. It had been built, event by event, message by message, visit by visit. Edwin and Sandra had been quietly drawing the circle smaller, and nobody had thought to tell her she'd been left outside it. She didn't go to Edwin. She went to the records. The original trust had been drafted by a solicitor named Gerald Partridge, long retired, but not difficult to find. She tracked him down through the Law Society's records and wrote him a letter. He replied within a week. He remembered the O.C. family clearly. He confirmed the trust had been established in 1984 and that Margaret had been named primary beneficiary from the outset. He also confirmed that he'd had no involvement in any subsequent amendments. The work had been passed to another firm, a Woking practice, at some point in the last decade. He hadn't been informed why. Margaret called the Woking firm. She was polite, methodical, and persistent. After several days of back and forth, they confirmed the trust had been formally amended 3 times in the past 5 years. She asked for the amendment dates. Then she cross-referenced them with something she'd kept without quite knowing why. A folder of Ruth's cognitive assessment records from the memory care facility. She'd collected them over the years, partly out of habit, partly because she'd wanted to understand what was happening to her mother. 2 of the 3 amendment dates fell within weeks of assessments, showing significant cognitive decline. Not during Ruth's better periods, during her worst ones. She sat with that for a long time. Edwin's email arrived on a Tuesday evening. It was longer than she'd expected, more considered. He acknowledged that she was upset. He said he understood why the documents had come as a shock. He said he wished the situation had been handled differently, that she'd been spoken to before the paperwork was finalized. And then he attached a letter. He said it was in Ruth's own handwriting, dated 2 years ago. In it, Ruth expressed a wish to simplify the estate, to reduce what she called conflict after I'm gone, and to ensure that everything was managed by someone who was present and consistent. Margaret read it twice. Ruth's handwriting was there, the slightly uneven loops, the way she always underlined her own name when she signed things. The phrasing sounded like her. The sentiment, not wanting her children to fight, sounded deeply, painfully like her. For a moment, Margaret felt the ground shift. Had Ruth really wanted this? She had been a private woman, the woman who hated fuss. Was it possible she'd made this decision clearly, quietly, and Margaret had simply been too far inside her own hurt to consider it? She almost called Edwin to say she understood. Then she checked the date on the letter against her folder. Ruth had been formally assessed as having moderate cognitive impairment 4 months before that letter was written. The ground shifted back. She thought it was just the trust. It wasn't just the trust. A conversation with a specialist solicitor, a woman named Claire Okafor, who worked in contested estates, opened up a layer Margaret hadn't thought to look for. Claire asked her to pull together every financial and legal document connected to Ruth she could find. What came back was worse than she'd expected. Ruth's personal savings account. One Margaret had sat beside her mother and helped her open at a Guildford branch 32 years ago, had been converted to a joint account with Edwin and Sandra 2 years earlier. The balance by that point was significant. The family home in Woking, the house Margaret had grown up in, the house Joseph Osei had built the trust to protect, had been transferred into Edwin's sole ownership 18 months ago. It had been done quietly. A standard transfer form. Edwin's signature. Ruth listed as the transferring party. Margaret stared at the documents spread across Claire's desk. This wasn't a family disagreement about a trust. This was a campaign. Methodical. Patient. Conducted over years, not months. Every asset her mother had, every account, every piece of property had been moved, piece by piece, while Margaret drove to Guildford and watered her garden and took Edwin at his word. The number wasn't the point. The point was that nothing was left. And somewhere in a memory care facility in Surrey, her mother had no idea. It took Margaret 3 weeks and the help of a patient advocate to get the visit approved. Ruth was having a good day. That's what the staff told her as they walked down the corridor. Clear patches came and went, and today was one of the clearer ones. Margaret stopped outside the door for a moment. Then she went in. Her mother was sitting by the window in a pale blue cardigan. Margaret didn't recognize. She looked smaller than the last time, lighter. But her eyes, when she looked up, were present, sharp in the way they used to be. She reached for Margaret's hand, and then she asked, in a voice that was quiet but steady, why Margaret had stopped coming. Not where she'd been, not a confused question, a direct one. The kind Ruth had always asked when she wanted a straight answer. Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. She understood it all then, not as a sequence of documents and dates, but as a human thing. Her mother hadn't withdrawn from her. Her mother had been waiting. Every canceled Sunday, every blocked visit, every message that hadn't been passed on. Ruth had felt all of it on the other side. Had felt Margaret's absence without knowing why it was there. She hadn't chosen this. She'd been managed into it, and she'd spent months wondering what she'd done wrong. Margaret held her mother's hand and didn't let go for a very long time. She cried in the car. Not during the visit. She hadn't let herself do that. But the moment she closed the door of her car in the car park, the composure she'd held for weeks came apart. She wasn't crying about the money. She needed to be clear about that. Even sitting alone in a car park in Surrey with nobody to say it to, it wasn't the house or the savings account or the trust her father had put her name on 40 years ago. It was the image she couldn't shake. Ruth at that window, asking why she'd stopped coming. Margaret had given 3 decades to this. She'd restructured her career around being close enough to show up. She'd paid the care home shortfall from her own savings without telling anyone, because that wasn't the kind of thing you announced. She'd shown up every Sunday, brought the biscuits Ruth liked, sat through the harder visits when her mother didn't know her name, and held her hand anyway. Edwin had looked at all of that. He'd seen it clearly for years, and he decided it didn't count. Not the visits, not the payments, not the 40 years. None of it had been enough to make him hesitate. He'd moved through it all, around her, beneath her, behind her, and not once had he picked up the phone. She sat in that car park until it was nearly dark. Then she started the engine and drove home. Claire Okafor was honest with her from the start, which Margaret respected. The case was not straightforward. 2 of the 3 trust amendments had been made during periods when Ruth's capacity was questionable. But proving undue influence in a court of law was a long and expensive process. The handwriting letter Edwin had produced, would need to be assessed. The cognitive assessment records were helpful but not conclusive on their own. These things took time. They took money, and they didn't always resolve the way they deserved to. Margaret told her she understood and asked her to proceed. Then Patience called. She'd been thinking, she said, about what Margaret had told her, about what she'd seen at Edwin's home over the past few years. There was something specific she wanted to put on record, something she'd pushed to the back of her mind but couldn't leave there any longer. She had been present at one of Ruth's signing appointments, not as a witness. She'd been visiting at the same time by coincidence, waiting in the hallway. Through the door, she'd heard Ruth ask for Margaret by name. Clearly, more than once. Sandra had come out of the room and told her that Margaret was busy and couldn't make it. Ruth had accepted it. She hadn't argued. She'd trusted them. Patience said she was sorry she hadn't spoken sooner. Margaret told her that speaking now was enough. The legal process moved slowly, the way these things do. There was no clean resolution. The trust wasn't fully restored. The house in Woking remained in Edwin's name while proceedings continued. Some of the savings were recovered, some weren't. Claire told her, carefully, that this was often how it ended, not with justice exactly, but with something closer to acknowledgement, a partial correction. A record that what had happened had happened. Margaret accepted that. What she hadn't expected was the tablet. Edwin had given Ruth an old device a few years back. For video calls, he'd said, though Ruth had rarely used it. When the memory care facility updated their equipment, a staff member found it at the back of a drawer and handed it to Margaret, assuming she'd want to keep it. She almost didn't open it, but she did. And inside the voicemail app, backed up without Edwin realizing, was a message Ruth had recorded and sent to him nearly 2 years ago. Her voice was thin, uncertain. She got confused partway through and had to find her thread again. But the meaning was clear. She wanted Edwin to fix the papers. She wanted Margaret put back in. She asked him to do it soon, because she wasn't sure how much time she had. Edwin had told her it was done. Margaret sat in her car in the same car park where she'd fallen apart weeks before. She listened to her mother's voice twice. Then she went inside and sat with Ruth by the window until visiting hours ended. She didn't need the trust anymore. She had something Edwin couldn't amend, transfer, or remove. Some things can't be put in the document. Turns out, that's exactly where she found the truth. Han.